is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week's interview is with Karen Garst, known to the secular movement as the Faithless Feminist. Her blog covers a variety of topics, including atheism, politics, and the relationship to women's issues. She is the editor of Women Beyond Belief, Discovering Life Without Religion, which was recently released by Patron Publishing. She describes the book as, quote, a collection of personal essays from 22 women from diverse backgrounds who tell their stories of leaving religion. From various Judeo-Christian traditions, they talk about the shame, guilt, and oppression religion imposed on them and how they freed themselves from its grip, unquote. She is also the editor of the forthcoming work, Women versus Religion, The Case Against Faith and for Freedom. Garst earned her PhD from the University of Wisconsin and formerly served as the executive director of the Oregon State Bar. We had an amazing conversation about her path out of religion, how her feminism informs her views of politics and atheism, her newest book, and her recent trip to the controversial Mythinformation Conference in Milwaukee. Karen is an essential voice in the atheist movement right now, and I'm so pleased to have her on the show. And so, here's my conversation with Karen Garst. Karen Garst, how's it going?
You know, I'm looking out a window from my forever home, and it's sunny. And I'm in Oregon, so that's surprising.
That's awesome. That's awesome. How much sun do you guys get a year, for the most part?
Oh, you know, it's the 6 to 8 months in the wintertime when it rains, which is tough.
Right on, right on. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. Really looking forward to a great conversation with you. So we'll just first talk about a little bit about your deconversion, how you got to atheism and free thought and kind of what your journey was and where you are now.
Okay, well, I was raised in Bismarck, North Dakota. So can you guess which religion I was raised in?
I'm not sure.
That'd be Lutheran.
Okay.
Yeah, there were a lot of, there was one Catholic church, and there were a lot of Protestant churches, and the denomination that had the most churches was Lutheran.
Okay.
So, and everybody I knew went to a church. There were maybe 6 Jewish families in town, and everybody knew they were, and everyone else was either, a Protestant or Catholic. I don't remember the word atheist. I don't remember the word skeptic. Everybody I knew went to church. And to me, church was really family. I knew all the families sitting in the pews. And so that's just what you did. And I often say I wouldn't have had any social life without Luther League. Because, we got together every week. We went bowling. We did activities. I was in the choir at church. You had confirmation. So that was really, a community, a circle of friends. And then I did go undergraduate, went to Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. But it was a very liberal college. The first class I had on Religion 101, they talked about the different oral strains of the Old Testament. The J, the E, the P, the D, and I'd never heard of that before. In my sophomore year, I did a report on gays. So again, very open-minded. Then I decided to go to grad school, and I was in Madison, Wisconsin in the 70s, and I never went to church. Nobody I knew went to church. It was pretty much the opposite of growing up in Bismarck. And I didn't want to go alone. I didn't see walking into a church. We didn't know anybody. And I had a lot of other things going on. And then I moved to Oregon, and, really wasn't until my late 30s that I said, okay, go to a church. And I joined a Lutheran church. It was very liberal. I got married to a lapsed Catholic, and we ended up at a New Thought church, which is kind of all paths to God, very non-denominational. People were Jewish, people were Christian, people were Muslim, whatever. And when that church went belly up, which is a whole other podcast in and of itself, we just drifted away. I never joined an atheist group. We slept in on Sundays. We raised our son secular. So I would say I became an atheist by reading books of the Jesus Seminar. The last one I read was Bishop John Shelby Spong's Resurrection, Myth or Reality. And I said, okay, there wasn't really a resurrection, and gave it up. So it was pretty unsensational, if you will.
Okay. I want to back up just a quick second because there's a phrase that you mentioned in there. You said the Jesus seminar. And I'd love to have you give us a quick summary as to what that is, because I've heard that mentioned before. I think maybe I've heard Ryan Bell talk about it when he used to be a Seventh-day Adventist or whatever. But I'd love to kind of get a quick overview of what that is.
Well, it was a group of scholars who came together, Marcus Borg, actually from Oregon, John Dominic Crowson, and a number of others who wanted to look at the historical Jesus, if you will, and examine it from a neutral perspective and to build on that. Now, they weren't necessarily atheists. In fact, Bishop John Shelby Spong, who was one of them, he keeps drifting away. Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but there still might be a God. The last book I read of, he was pretty close to giving it all up. But they came together. One of the things they did was they did an annotation of the New Testament saying, what do they think Jesus could have said? What is it very unlikely he said? And it was actually made Time magazine with their color coding. And, I had that book for ages and then I got rid of it. I didn't know I was going to take on this new life. I've heard John Dominic Crowson speak, very interesting, a scholarly look, if you will, versus a theological perspective or an atheist perspective. So I would highly recommend their books. There's now something called Jesus Seminar on the Road, which tries to continue that. And I've gone to some of their presentations.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. My story is very similar to you. I mean, I grew up with, non-religious parents. My parents were secular. And so I pretty much grew up with a secular upbringing. And I don't even think I heard the word atheist until I was maybe 18. And I just read it on a wiki page of a musician that I liked. It just said so-and-so is an atheist. And I was like, well, what's that? So I click it and I just read the wiki page about atheism. And at that point I was kind of getting into religion. And as a kid, religion meant very little to me. But by high school, I was sort of learning more and more about religion and studying religions. And then I just kind of learned about atheism through this wiki page. And then I started reading stuff. And I was like, I think I'm this. And then by the time I got it, it was the summer and fall of 2009. By the time I started freshman year of college, I was, I had read Dawkins and I had read Dennett, Hitchens, Sam Harris. And I was like, yeah, I'm done. I'm an atheist and that's kind of what I am. It was one of those things where I had tried different hats and none of them fit.
So what was it like, if I might be the interlocutor here?
Sure.
What was it like growing up? Were your friends non-religious? And where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Shelbyville, Indiana, which is about 45 minutes southwest of Indianapolis. Today, it's probably a suburb of Indianapolis, which is where I live now. And growing up, my parents were not religious. My dad probably defines himself as probably an agnostic. He's not terribly comfortable with the word atheist yet. My mom is sort of spiritual in the way that how some women will or some people, I shouldn't gender specify here, but some people will post sort of deepity kind of memes on Facebook. That's kind of how my mom is kind of spiritual, I guess. But she's very open to stuff that I've talked about. But growing up, I can probably count on one hand the amount of times I've been to church for a religious service. Most of them I went to was for weddings or funerals or, social events, things like that. My friends really weren't religious growing up. I had friends who, this is interesting. I had friends whose dad was a Catholic and whose mother was Jewish. So they did everything. So they did Hanukkah and they did Christmas and they did, synagogue as well as I think mass, and they bounced back and forth. But other than that, most of my friends were either non-religious or if they were religious, it didn't really matter. And so growing up, I always used to make the joke of Garfield comics and pro wrestling meant more to me as a kid than Jesus. And so, that was kind of what it was like. And then it just never came up. And it didn't really come up until my mom and dad got divorced when I was 14. And my dad and I moved up north to a very, very small town in the middle of nowhere called Bunker Hill, Indiana. and I started going to this small rural high school. And that was really that was when I got religion. That was not in the sense that I became religious, but like I finally was exposed to religion in a big way.
That's fascinating. Such a different experience.
Yeah, it's weird, because a lot of friends I have in this movement, a lot of people I've talked to in the atheist movement, a lot of them, they either sort of came from a sort of liberal theological background like yourself and then eventually sort of got out, or they were part of a fundamentalist group, or my friend Chris Shelton, who was a former Scientologist for 25 years, and they've had very extreme versions of religion. And growing up, I just didn't really have it. And so I always feel like with religion that I'm kind of the guy who doesn't feel bad about not winning the lottery because I never bought a ticket.
There you go.
So that's I guess that's kind of me in a nutshell. It is very weird, especially growing up in the Midwest and Indiana, which is in some respects in the Bible Belt. To a certain extent, we're pretty religious here. So you've lost your religion and you're kind of discovering who you are in a new way. And what gravitates you? So what is your PhD in? That's a good question to start with.
Well, my PhD is a Marxist analysis of the French school system.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool.
Well, I was in a very progressive curriculum instruction department, and I speak French. So they wanted me to study a French sociologist of education called Pierre Bourdieu. Mm-hmm. And so I took that on. But I never went into academia. It was the 70s. There weren't a lot of jobs, and it was interesting, but I'd kind of lost interest in it.
Okay, right on. And then so what have you spent most of your career doing? So you're an author. I know you were at time the former director of the Oregon State Bar and stuff like that. So how did you sort of get into atheist activism? And then I guess my sort of follow-up question is, how did you go from, Karen, the new non-believer, to Karen, the faithless feminist?
Well, I was having lunch with a friend of mine in 2014, and she's an author. She said, Karen, you should write a book. Well, it happened to be 2 days after the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, 5 Catholic men, I might add, issued their decision in Burwell v. Hobby Lobby. And in that decision, they said that Hobby Lobby, even though it was a privately held company, that it could have religious views. And there was this Religious Freedom Restoration Act that kind of went on before that. There was a decision, there was an act that allowed them to do this, to say, okay, well, you don't have to provide certain forms of birth control, morning after pills and different things like that, to your female employees because of your religious views. Now, they did accommodate that by having the government pay. But here, this corporation, which isn't a person, gets to have religious views, and religious views that allow it not to comply with the law. And I lost it. And so I told her, I said, well, the only book I'm interested in writing is something against religion. And so it started out, and I started to recruit people who could tell their personal stories of leaving religion. And I think what's really important is we all need models. Do you remember that little black kid who looked up at Obama in the White House?
I sure do.
What that did for him was say, wow, here's a guy who has the same skin color as I am. He's president of the United States. I can be that. When I was growing up, women saw teachers, secretaries, and nurses. And it's not that you couldn't break out of that, but it doesn't even occur to you. Because you see that. So I think it's really important to provide women models of women who've gone through this process of deconverting. And they may identify with some saying, that's exactly what I'm going through. They may say, wow, that was a lot easier than what I'm going through. That's a lot harder than what I'm going through. But there's 22 women in this book, which is called Women Beyond Belief, Discovering Life Without Religion, to give women a model. If you take and look at the top 100 best-selling books on atheism, about 94% of those are written by men. And so we don't have a lot of diversity of writing in the atheism movement by women. And a lot of women will write one book and then quit. They will do it for some reason and they'll stop. But what I did, as I was writing my book, I hired a marketing person, and he told me, well, the first thing you have to do is have a blog. You can't have a book without a blog. So I got that all set up and the website. And his first suggestion for the title was Godless Grandmother. And I said, could we pick something that doesn't really indicate my age quite that way? And so he came up with Faithless Feminist. And I became a feminist in the 60s and 70s. I had no idea what transpired with that word. I didn't know anything about intersectionality, social justice warriors, third wave feminism, anything. So I thought it was great. And I started writing and I started reading. Yes, I had been raised in a religion. I had read a lot of the Jesus seminar books, but I thought, well, if I'm going to do a blog, I have to learn more. So probably in the last 3 years, I've read 120 books on religion, on mythology, on atheism, and it's been fascinating for me.
That's awesome. That's really, really great. I mean, that's very similar to what happened with me. So the Hobby Lobby decision was a huge turning point in my life too, because at the time I was an FFRF member and I still am, but I need to renew. Don't tell them. But they had an essay contest about how does religion sometimes like harm the public square, and particularly they had something about the Hobby Lobby decision as a scholarship essay contest. And I just wrote this polemic about why I thought the court was so wrong, about the idea of the whole case, alongside a few other things, but the whole case hinged on the idea of how we define deeply held religious beliefs, which in my opinion is a completely nonsensical phrase. And the problem with the Hobby Lobby decision, alongside some of the many really valid points that you've made, is that it creates a situation in which the government is picking winners and losers by virtue of how we define deeply held religious beliefs. Because obviously, in that case, they sided with capital over labor. So the people who worked for Hobby Lobby, their opinion didn't really matter all that much, which is a point that Justice Ginsburg made in her dissent, which was fantastic. What about their beliefs? The fact that you're going to side with one automatically sort of means that you're harming the other. And that's why making a case like this and making a point to give them some kind of privilege really harms everyone, because then you do get in the business of picking winners and losers. And in my opinion, it was just sort of corporatism and corporate welfare under the guise of religion, because this company didn't want to pay for something. And it all gets into that classic argument, is a corporation a person? And in my opinion, it isn't. It's an entity, it's a thing, but it's not a human being. It shouldn't be given the same rights under the Constitution as a person. And so I wrote about this, and I won third place, and I got a scholarship which allowed me to go to Washington, D.C. the next year and do research on my thesis. I wrote my master's thesis on Robert Ingersoll. And
good for you.
Thank you. And his contributions to Midwestern free thought. And some of that I do bring up his relationship with early leaders within the women's rights movement, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Helen Hunt Gardner, and of course his wife, Ava Parker Ingersoll, who was a very huge influence on his life. In many ways, she was sort of a lifelong free thinker, and she sort of pushed him in that direction after the Civil War. So I always like to say we got the great agnostic because of the great agnostic's wife. And so she was amazing. Anyway, the Hobby Lobby thing was a huge part of my turning point too, because it was just nonsense. And like you said, it was 5 Catholic men making the decision. And of course that bias is just astounding to me.
Exactly. Well, the way I look at it is, you can have any belief you want. If you're home, the doors are closed. You can do what you want. You can say what you want. You can go to church, fine. But when you create a business, you're on the public square, figuratively, of course. And anyone who's on that public square should be able to walk in. And that's why we have the issues with the bakery. Nobody made you start a business. You could have done whatever you could have worked for somebody else. But once you decide that you want a business, then you happen to be open to everyone. Then you have to make a cake for everyone. And you have to abide by the laws. Now, of course, the big exception has always been Catholic hospitals, and there are a lot of those. And so when the Affordable Care Act came, which is what the Hobby Lobby decision was about, they accommodated Catholic hospitals. So they kind of started the ball rolling. And then when it got to Hobby Lobby, well, gee, if we accommodate the Catholic hospitals, we should accommodate them. But the whole thing to me is just, how can a corporation have a deeply or mildly or medium held religious belief?
I completely agree. And it's a question of, and it goes back to the thing I mentioned earlier, which is like, okay, if you're going to define a corporation as having a deeply held religious belief, is that by virtue of who owns it? Is that by virtue of who runs it? Is it by virtue of who works for it? Or is it by virtue of who benefits from it? It's a very wishy-washy, squishy term. And the other thing is, I totally agree with you about the cake baking situation. I mentioned this last week on my podcast with Jim Helton, that it has been established case law in this country for nearly a century for the principle of what's called places of public accommodation. And it is a standard practice by which you can discriminate against a person or not allow them business, say they don't pay you, or they're rude, or they're harming your business by like physically assaulting you or destroying your property. But you cannot tell somebody that they can't have something simply by virtue of the fact that you don't like what their sexual orientation or their gender identity or their race or their religion, because you work in the public. And by virtue of being a place of public accommodation, you have to accommodate to everyone. And when you are discriminating against other people, you're by virtue discriminating against everybody. And that was the whole point of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was the linchpin that made some of the Dixiecrats hesitant, and it led to the long filibuster of the Civil Rights Act, was this idea of places of public accommodation. This principle is overwhelmingly won out, and I think it's the right position to have.
And you do realize that sex got added to the 1904 Civil Rights Act because they thought it was going to fail if they added that.
Yes.
So we were kind of added as an afterthought, but yes, I totally agree.
And so it's an interesting thing because the one thing that is interesting to me about some of the Hobby Lobby decision or the theocrats in general is they have this very warped sense of what they would deem as freedom. And I always go back to the pivotal question, which is freedom for whom? Is it freedom for you? Is it freedom for everybody? Is it freedom for just the people that you like or the people you want in power? Because again, like I said, the moment the government starts picking winners and losers on this level is when everybody's freedom is violated and everybody's freedom is harmed. So it just doesn't make any sense to sort of play favorites with one thing over another simply by virtue of whatever beliefs that they have.
Well, and I think you mentioned the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and I just saw something today. I didn't read the whole article, but they appointed some theocratic person to some new department about religious freedom or something. I don't know, but I'm I didn't have a chance to read it, but I'm very leery about those things as well.
Oh, for sure. So let's go into talking a little bit about your book. So it came out last year. It was published by Pitchstone Publishing. Very cool. It's called Women Beyond Belief, Discovering Life Without Religion. And I will leave a link for the Amazon in the description box of this podcast. And you have a collection of personal essays from 22 women from diverse backgrounds who tell their stories of leaving religion. So what was, besides the Hobby Lobby decision, what other sort of motivations helped get this book together, and how did you find writers, and what were some of the conclusions that your writers drew?
Well, one of the issues for me in the Hobby Lobby decision is, we went through this in the 60s and 70s. We fought hard for reproductive rights. When I was at Concordia College, my undergraduate institution, at that point in time, the abortion was only legal in the state of New York. And we put an ad in our student newspaper with a phone number to call New York, and the president impounded all the newspapers. They didn't want to talk about that. They wouldn't let us send them out. And so it was a real restrictive time. At the same time, people were fighting to change it. And I look at all the young women today. You do not need to have to fight over reproductive rights. This is ridiculous. We did that. We want to move on. And so I feel I'm writing for young women, so they can have more freedom than we did, and they don't have to fight the battles we fought. And in order to get authors, I started with my friends, and I pretty much knew who was an atheist and who wasn't. And then I started to go to secular groups in town, and there was a women's group associated with the Humanists of Greater Portland, and there was a Center for Inquiry, and I asked if anyone wanted to write, so I kind of collected those. And then I went on social media and tried to, seek out some people. So I have a woman who was born in Zimbabwe, who's a lesbian, who lives in the Midwest, who wrote. I have somebody who grew up in Germany, more or less secular. A woman who grew up in England who said the way you find out directions is they say it's next to the Lucky Lab, the pub. And she moved to the United States and they said it's next to the Presbyterian Church. And she goes, what? I don't know where the Presbyterian Church is. And I actually got one of the scholarship winners that year of the Freedom from Religion Scholarship to write. So the women are from 18 to 70, all different, kind of walks of life. They all do come from a Judeo-Christian background. There weren't any ex-Muslims in this particular book. But if you want, I'd be happy to read a couple excerpts just to give your listeners a feeling for what the book's like.
I would love that. Thank you.
Okay, the first one is by Anne Wilcox, and she was raised fundamentalist. 30 years after letting go of her religion, she experiences the following. As I tried to let my beliefs go, my head seemed far ahead of the rest of me. I would think, that makes no sense. But I would be assailed by intense fear and doubt. I felt all of my old fears and beliefs still skulking inside, like the biblical Leviathan, a sea monster that lurked in the deep. I felt wrong, as though I had committed a terrible crime and I was going to be punished. Whenever I got near anything to do with my religion, a Christian coworker, a bumper sticker, a debate, or a speaker, something on the internet or the news, even, or especially, my own family, I went into a tailspin of dread and doubt for days. I kept thinking the fear would diminish, but it went on for months and months. My fear was so ingrained that as I wrestled with my beliefs, I had shadowy nightmares, and I felt like things were creeping up on me in the middle of the night. As I sat in my chair reading, there were times when I involuntarily glanced upward, as if lightning might crash through my ceiling. When I attacked my beliefs about Satan, it felt as if he was in my room with me. This was a complete surprise, not to mention freaky. After 30 years away from my religion, my mind was still being assaulted with irrational fear for disbelieving.
Wow, that's some pretty powerful stuff. I mean, it reminds me very much of stories that I know Dan Barker tells about various other people who leave religion, have left religion behind for decades, and yet they still have those haunting nightmares about the threat of hell and things like that. Some very, very interesting and powerful stuff there.
And then I'll do another one. Her background was Jehovah's Witness. And, you're only supposed to be with Jehovah's Witnesses while she goes to college. She falls in love. She's with her boyfriend. And she finally decides to sleep with him. And some friend she told ratted her out to the Jehovah's Witnesses. And she gets called before a tribunal of elders. 3 men, of course. And she learns later that one of them was having an adulterous affair with a married woman. So talk about the pot calling the kettle black. And part of that process, they said to her about her boyfriend, you must consider him a tool of Satan. And she says, my face refused to remain neutral as my ears took in this sentence. Did I hear him right? With an expression of incredulity and confusion, I looked back at the elder who'd just spoken and the 2 others on the panel with him and replied, I don't see how that's possible. I don't think you understand. I love him. This isn't just a crush. I love him. I wouldn't be with just anybody. Jehovah is a God of love, and this is love. So I don't see how that is even remotely connected to Satan. Satan is using him to draw you away from Jehovah and is disguising himself as this boy, another elder chimed in. Oh, silly Kale, you hadn't realized that you'd fallen in love with the devil. And then she goes on to talk about she had to wait in the room to see if she was going to be, whatever the word in Jehovah's Witnesses for excommunicated. And she comes back and they decide that she's going to stay. And at that point, she just totally lost her faith. So those are just two examples of these 22 essays of women saying what it felt like. And I think what's really interesting about women is it's women who are subjugated by religion. And in the appendix to this book, I kind of outlined the Bible and its attitude toward women. And it's fascinating to me that we still have the majority of people in religion are women, and the majority of people who are atheists are men. And I think there's a lot of, rational reasons for that. There's the issue of community. There's the issue of ritual. There's raising your children. But we really need to address women and talk to them about the history of this religion. I do a presentation called From Goddess to God, Elimination of the Feminine Divine. And it's on my YouTube channel where it was recorded in a presentation I made. And that's the Faithless Feminist if you just go to YouTube. And I talk about, in early Paleolithic, Neolithic, people worshiped the earth, the Mother Earth. And can you imagine what it was like for a Paleolithic man who goes out and hunts, gets hit with a spear, bleeds and dies? Yet when women, they bleed every month and they don't die. And then there's these 9 months when they don't bleed and then they have a child. And the woman's menstrual cycles are the same number as the lunar cycles. So it's totally natural that they would have a reverence for, I'm not going to call it a religion, but a reverence for this kind of mother, goddess, female entity. And when religion comes around, particularly monotheism, they take all the symbols of the goddess, the snake, because of the rejuvenation, and these other symbols, and turn it on its head and make the woman the bad guy. So even, you can take 2 paragraphs of Genesis and see how all of those symbols have been switched to be derogatory. And they did that to put down the goddess. And yet it's women who still cling to that religion.
Yeah, I've always thought of that as being a rather interesting thing. And one thing I've really thought a lot about lately, I've been doing a series of dialogues with a Christian for his website about secular humanism and talking about some of the sort of communal and experiential benefits of religion that people take advantage of, that sense of community fellowship, the feeling of comfort and togetherness. And how can we as humanists, how can we as secular humanists develop a certain type of community or ethic or lifestyle that helps to complement that? Because that's really, I think, the challenge. I think it's why a lot of people, particularly women, stay in religion, because they want to make sure they're maybe that they want that sense of comfort. Sadly, for a lot of women in some very conservative parts of our country, the church is the only place to turn to. And so, or they want to make sure that their kids have morals or something like that. And so, I know that I think maybe Robert Putnam in his book on religious trends that he wrote with, trying to remember the other guy's last name. Anyway, but he talks about how with the rise of independent working women in the 1960s through the 70s and now through today, that because more and more women are in the workplace, they don't have as much extra time. And so this has also been a contributing factor to the growing rise of the nuns, the people who were unchurched. And I think that's an interesting trend. And maybe we as secular people, we need to develop some kind of community, some kind of resource network to help sort of placate what people have had to always go to religion for.
Yeah, and a couple of issues around that. I think you're totally right. Sikivu Hitchinson, who is an African-American writer, she wrote a book called Moral Combat, and she outlines, particularly in the African-American community, that church is a safety net. So that's something to consider. We do have a number of humanist groups. We have Sunday Assembly and the various other organizations. But I think what's interesting, there was a book written, it's probably 20 years ago, called Bowling Alone. And I was talking about my experience bowling. Remember bowling leagues? Well, people don't do that much anymore. There's so many other things distracting people. They're on social media, they're on YouTube, they're doing this, they're doing that. So part of it is people feel that sense of community less, that they need to go somewhere to get it. So I think that's going to be a factor. And you're right, women are working. They don't have time to clean the altars and put up the flowers. When my dad became deacon of the Lutheran church I went to, he came home and told my mom, the wives of the deacons clean the altars. And she said, I didn't agree to be deacon. I didn't run to be deacon. I guess you'll have to do that. Good for her. Said, I'm not doing that. But certainly the women play that role. My 96-year-old Catholic mother-in-law is still in charge of the potlucks for funerals at her Catholic parish.
Wow.
Now, they got to be a little desperate to depend on a 96-year-old to get the food for the funeral. So I do think it's changing, but we seem to need that belonging to a large group less. But the problem is once you belong to it, it's hard to let go. One of my authors, Marcia Abelman, said she was going to a church, and when she and her husband deconverted and left, not a single person in that church would have anything to do with them again. So it's kind of a lot to give up. And so I see where that's difficult. But if you're like me, who I feel we should get rid of religion, I think it's childhood indoctrination. And I don't think it's good to teach children that they're going to go to hell. That can be very damaging psychologically. We're going to have to address women. We're going to have to address the needs that we can provide outside of the church. We're going to have to talk to people about how this religion was created, how it doesn't support women, etc. And I am also working on a second book. It's called Women versus Religion, The Case Against Faith and for Freedom. And that book isn't personal stories. It's more topic by topic is how did we get to where we are today? And I have African Americans, Hispanic, there's an ex-Muslim. I have Abby Hafer, who wrote a book, The Not So Intelligent Designer. She talks a lot about biology. Valerie Tirico goes through the whole Bible and talks about women are represented as chattel. And I had the idea that I would really like to push that with women's studies departments. How can you study women's studies or gender studies and not look at the role of religion? So we'll see how that goes.
That's fantastic. You anticipated my next question, which was going to be about your newest book. When I was searching earlier today, I found that as well. That sounds like a fascinating volume. I look forward to checking out both of these books more in detail after our little discussion here. I guess we'll move to, in some respects, sadly, the elephant in the room that's been going on over the last week or so, which is you attended MythCon. You're more courageous than me. I tweeted out something about, I said, I've been reading the real-time stuff from Dan Broadbent, who does Science Enthusiast, and some other people, and man, all that just harsh my mellow. I'm not gonna lie. So if you'd be so kind, illuminate us about, because you tried, I think you tried very valiantly to stick it to Carl Benjamin, who is known to the internet as Sargon of Akkad. So kind of illuminate us on your experience at MythCon.
Well, I had been on their podcast once, and I did a Skype presentation of the presentation I mentioned earlier to their group, and I met them at ReasonCon. So I felt I knew them pretty well. I really enjoyed talking to them and being on their show. And they asked me to do some advertising and give away some free tickets through my blog, which I did. And in exchange, they offered me 2 VIP tickets. And at that point in time, the program was a lot about the movie Batman vs. Jesus. David Rubin was on the first brochure. And, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at it, I will admit. And I agreed to go, and I'd already purchased my tickets and talked an old friend of mine in from grad school to come with me and rented the hotel room. So I kind of felt like I really can't change my mind 2 weeks beforehand. And what had happened was David Rubin decided not to come, and they substituted Sargon of Akkad. I think it's pretty clear from the evidence that I've seen that they knew him and they liked him. They were trying to fill a slot with David Rubin, and they picked Sargon of Akkad. And as you know, when people go to conferences, they don't pay a lot of attention until the day before and going, oh, now who's going to be here again? And a lot of people decided that they would leave because they didn't support who he was. I knew who he was. I've watched his videos. I've seen Christy Winters debate him. And frankly, I thought it would be interesting. Well, I went to the conference, and the first presenters were Armored Skeptic and Shoe on Head. I've never heard before him. But here you are at a conference with 400, 500 people, and Shoe on Head, whose name is June, gets up and said, I've never made a presentation in public before. And you go, great, they really got somebody who had a lot of experience to talk to us. But she's got 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. And I watched a few of her YouTubes after I came home. And, you know, what can I say? I mean, it's comedy, it's mocking. It wasn't very relevant, I thought. And, you know, if you want to talk about people, one of her videos, she had somebody saying, well, I don't like to be called sweetie. And she mocked that. And then she had somebody else. I thought, you know, there's more important things happening. And then they had Sargon of Akkad, and they had Thomas Smith, who has a podcast, interview him, moderate. Well, you know, it was all going to downhill when the first comments were about what Sargon said to a British member of parliament who had been raped, who was trying to do something on the internet. And what she was trying to do on the internet may have been restrictive, I don't know. But he made the comment in Twitter that was directed at her saying, I wouldn't even rape you, which is, to me, is you just never say that, right? And
yeah.
the audience clapped. And what really bothered me was sitting in an audience. It was a majority men. There were women who were clapping, but it was mostly these men, young men. And I said, wow, what's come of our society and how we raise children that these people would clap to a comment like that. And then it was all downhill. And Sargon of Akkad is really interesting. I had a chance to talk to him privately, and he is an anti-feminist, and he is against, he says that intersectionality is a result of Marxist collectivism, which I couldn't get my handle around. But he has this idea that, all we have to do is equal opportunity, and then individual outcomes are fine. He talked about people in a ghetto. Well, yeah, but that's their community, and if they want to leave, they can. I mean, totally ridiculous. And he said, there's no reason why I should be dismissed because I'm a white man. Well, it depends what you're talking about. You know, if you're talking about feminism, your opinion is fine. But don't you think you maybe have some women on that panel to talk about it as well? So when he was done talking, I stood up at the mic and said, I'm the Faithless Feminist. And I firmly believe that religion is the last cultural barrier to gender equality. We need to get women out of the churches, and we're not going to do it by listening to two white men talk about feminism and intersectionality. They could be part of a panel, totally fine. But if you're going to be the only expert out there about feminism, I do have a problem with that. And it was depressing to sit through that, and particularly to hear all the applause. And I felt really bad for Thomas Smith.
Yeah, and you know, this is very interesting. So first off, you know, kudos to you for sticking to your guns and trying to ask him I think a legitimate question, which is, you know, Sargon claims that he is what you would call a classical liberal. Now, in some respects, I'm a classical liberal, and I want nothing to do with somebody like Sargon of Akkad. You know, I get his point about the danger of collectivism. I understand his point on that. I understand his point about individual rights. I totally understand that. But I do think it's unwise to have a discussion about feminism in this way, especially if it's a critique of feminism, where a woman is not present. There's something really weird about that, and I think something that's very wrong. I listened to the organizers of MythCon speak on Callie Wright's podcast, and their argument was about what he had said about this woman was, well, entertainers make this point all the time. We had Bill Maher who said the N-word. You had George Carlin who said things that are offensive, this and that and the other, and we have to give space for entertainers to say certain things that might be offensive. Now, it's one thing to call someone an entertainer. I don't think Sargon of Akkad sees himself as an entertainer. He may think he's entertaining, but what I really do think he is, which I think he wants to be, is a public intellectual. In many respects, that's what he's trying to be. So this idea of hiding behind the idea of being an entertainer, when in reality what you're actually doing is political and social commentary, which you might be doing in an entertaining way, is different from telling an off-color joke. And what he said in regards to that one comment with that British woman is absolutely unconscionable. If you're an adult, no matter how, say, quote-unquote conservative or classically liberal you are, there's really just no excuse for that kind of rhetoric. And I'm a free speech guy. He can say whatever he wants, but I have all the right in the world to use my free speech to say what he said was absolutely atrocious and doesn't belong in polite conversation and doesn't belong in a rigorous discussion about the merits or the demerits of feminism as an ideology. And what I find this doing is it's this sort of race to the bottom culture where we have people like Sargon, we have people like, Shoe on Head or whatever, or we have people like, Dusty Smith or whatever, or TJ, the Amazing Atheist or whatever, that have really, in my respects, really tarnished in what I think many of us have tried to achieve. And, and I've been critical of some of the things that have been going on within the extreme left, which, maybe that gets me to agree with Sargon and some things, I don't know. But that does not mean I would say something like, I wouldn't even rape you, or use the N-word multiple times in a video to get a point across or something like that. I just don't think that kind of conversation is constructive.
Well, and I think this whole issue of collectivism, he sounded a bit to me like Ayn Rand. Now, I have read books about her, but it's been a while. But one of the questions I wanted to pose was saying, okay, you think we're all individuals and we just need to cut our own path. Well, how did women get the right to vote? Did one of them say, I'm just going to go in and vote? Oh, that didn't work. What did they do? They came together, men and women, and passed an amendment that said women now have the right to vote. How did we deal with Jim Crow? People were being segregated. People were being lynched. Well, we had a civil rights movement, and we had Martin Luther King, and people marched, and people got killed, and we got a Civil Rights Act passed. That's how laws are made. They're collective action. And did people have more rights after the Civil Rights Act were passed? Absolutely. And there are areas where there needs to be more collective action, certainly. And that's how we get things done. So I think it's pretty naive to say, oh, I just want equal of opportunity and it's individual and it doesn't matter. Well, of course it matters. My experience growing up with two parents in a middle-class family in Bismarck, North Dakota, where my mother was highly educated, is different. Somebody growing up in a ghetto in New York who's maybe a single parent, doesn't, can't get a job, etc., where there's a lot of violence, that experience is totally different. You can't say we walk to college and we start the same. Not at all. So how do we make that a little more equal? How do we remove some of those barriers? And the other comment I would make, this whole SJW, intersectionality, I was at Portland State University when David Rubin and Christina Hoff Summers were there, and we had a little after party in the bar, and I walked up to this table because I got there early, and there were 8 students at the university, women. I asked them, do you know what SJW meant? None of them did. I mean, there's a small group of people on social media who use these tags, but I asked at coffee this morning, there were 6 women. Do you know what SJW means? No. Do you know what intersectionality means? No. So there's chattering on the margins. That's not the bulk of people. If you ask people on the street what feminism means, they'll tell you gender equality. So I guess if you want to go over here and chatter about something that really doesn't matter, go for it. I do think they shouldn't have had him, and I will critique them because of that. I do think they should have had more women, and I will critique them because of that. But once they invited him and he was on, then I think the response is, I'm not going to come. Then you make that individual response. I didn't like it that Richard Dawkins was deplatformed. Somebody else was deplatformed at Berkeley. I say it's if you don't like it, don't go. Or fill out the survey like I did, saying those speakers were terrible. There was one very good speaker, and that was Melissa Chen. She did an excellent job of talking about how have we lost the values of the Enlightenment and where we need to go. And then I'm not going to remember his name, but Faisal, who is an ex-Muslim, talked to a woman who's a Reform Muslim. I want to think her first name is Azza, but I'm not sure about that. Mm-hmm. And that was interesting. But, even the movie Batman versus Jesus, which was, I thought, really well done, and I made a contribution to it, there was one woman in it. Every atheist they had was a man, to the best of my knowledge. Could we have a little diversity, please? If you want to talk about these things, let's have a broad group of people who have different opinions talk about it.
I could not agree with you more. I was very bothered by the idea that I've been a podcaster for a while now, probably over a year, and I've done, at this point, 3 different shows. This is the 3rd show I've done now. And you will be episode, I think, 17? Yeah, that's in the lineup, yeah. And I didn't have a female guest until episode 14. And I'm very bothered by that because I tried. And not to say that I couldn't get them or they didn't want me or whatever, but it was just this weird thing where it was harder, sadly harder to find them at first. But now I've got a whole bunch, which is really great. I have you, my friend Kelsey, of course, Zarin, who connected us together, and my friend Adrian, and I've had, it's been really nice. So I hope that the balance is coming forth. And I think I've really only had, to this point, I've only had one person of color, and I want to change that too. I think the thing that's very important to me is that some of the values that somebody like Sargon of Akkad claims to believe in, I don't think he's a great representation of it. And I know that the MythCon guys, when they were on Callie's podcast, made this constant point of the traditional, hey, let's all get together and bash God model of conferences is dying, and we need something to change it up. And my thing in the subject is, why would you, in order to shake something up, why would you bring in these people who really aren't that well credentialed, really aren't that well established, and quite frankly, they're not terribly good at sort of bridge building. If your whole point is to be accessible to people, then you don't get the guy who says, I won't rape you. I wouldn't even rape you on Twitter. You get that guy. That's the guy you get to sort of try to break through the mainstream. It's pretty sad. And we could have had really interesting speakers who make some of the sort of broader points that Sargon makes, but in a much more effective way. People like Michael Shermer, Steven Pinker is somebody, is another person who could have a great conversation about some of these issues. Yeah. Those are people who could have a serious contribution, not just some asshole with a YouTube. That's really the thing that's driving me crazy. And, there are other conventions that I know of, Skepticon and others, that are doing just fine. And they're going to be fine. And I think that, MythCon's going to be hurt by this. I don't think they're going to be benefited.
Yeah, and I looked up their names. It was Faisal Saeed Al-Muhtar and Azra Nomani. And those two were very interesting as well, and I want to give them credit for that. I think the funny thing to me is, I think the comment that Sargon made after mine was, oh, I as a white man can't talk about this. It was almost like the victim. It was like, oh, I don't get to talk about it? Well, hey, that's not something you're probably an expert in. And if you take this position, let's have somebody who represents the other side. And to me, that'd be a woman. And I did tell him at the party as I left that if he wanted to talk to a feminist on his show, I'd be happy to talk to him. So we'll see. But I think there's a lot of things left to talk about at a MythCon. I was, this whole issue of how did we get to monotheism and how did we drop the feminine divine is fascinating, because part of our culture today is because of that. Our attitudes are because of that. Let's take a look at the history. I think when you go back and see how something was formed, we could have had a discussion about, where we are with gender equality. That might, from a skeptical perspective, be very interesting. But let's do it with people who have some research, who are credible in the field, who aren't just doing it to make a name for themselves. And he said so many times when Thomas asked him a question, I don't care. Well, is that how you do debate? I don't think so.
Yeah, and first off, it's not intellectually honest either. So when he responded with so you don't want me to speak about this, that's a complete non sequitur. You weren't saying, hey, I don't want you to speak about this. You were making a point of, hey, maybe you guys are the last people to talk about this subject. I'm not saying you can't. I'm just critiquing the fact that you're the only two on stage. So he was just deflecting. I mean, he didn't even really answer your question. And I know, because I watched the video that I think you put on your Twitter of the exchange or whatever, and the gentleman who talked to him, Thomas, and Carl made the point of like, oh, well, you shouldn't have been here either. You shouldn't have accepted the invitation. And Thomas was like, I accepted the invitation because they asked me, and I felt like I needed to be somebody who tried to grill you a little bit. If they had asked a woman, I probably would have deferred to that or something like that. The whole thing is a mess, and I hate, honestly, devoting oxygen and brain cells to it, but I just really felt like it was important because, like I said, I think it takes a lot of courage to stick up to somebody like that who is a professional shit stirrer. I mean, that's what he does. So I think it's courageous on your level. Back to your discussion about the idea of the moving away from the sort of feminine notions of mythology. I find that fascinating. So I don't know that much about mythology, but I do find it fascinating that these sort of classical mythological tales about women and women's relationship to goddesses and things like that, and how it switches to this male sort of dominated theological space. I know you give a whole talk about this, but if you want to spend a couple minutes giving me just the cliff notes of why you think that change happened, I'd love to hear it.
Oh, it was all downhill from private property and agriculture. If that's the short answer. If you look at hunter-gatherers today, and that's all we have to look at really is today, they're much more egalitarian. They share. They don't have property. They don't stay in one place. They don't have all that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Well, when you start herding and cattle, goats, whatever it is, sheep, or when you start having agriculture, then you have private property and it's defined. Maybe you put a fence around it and you want to protect that. Well, then you get into the notion of, well, how am I going to protect it? Well, maybe we need a city and maybe we need walls, and then you're my tribe and it's that tribe. And religion serves as a wonderful way to create the us versus them. And so from private property, you get this notion of the man says, I want this to go to my son. Well, the only way I can know it's my son is if she's a virgin when I marry her and if she doesn't commit adultery. Otherwise, I might be leaving this property to somebody who's not my son. So that has a lot to do with it. And eventually what happens is a religion develops. And of course, it's not a secular society. It's all religion. And it becomes more or less male dominated. There are some theories that the Kurgan tribes moved down from the north and they had horses and they were more, they had a thunder god, a lightning god, a thunderbolts, etc. And they may have influenced, but we had pantheons of god and goddesses for a long time before monotheism. And monotheism developed across many cultures. The Babylonian myth called Enuma Elish, Marduk, who's one of the male gods, and he says to his other male gods, look, make me top dog, and I'll get rid of Tiamat, who's the woman. And there's so many parallels between Enuma Elish and the Bible. I mean, it isn't even funny. But that's pretty much exactly what happened, is they eliminated the female divine, got to monotheism. And in terms of women's rights, it was all downhill from there.
That's so interesting. I'm definitely looking forward to watching your full presentation, and I will make sure to include a link for that in the show notes as well. Karen, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to you, hearing your perspective. And was there anything else you'd like to cover before we finish up?
Not at all, but you're on my spreadsheet now, so when my second book comes out, I'll let you know.
That sounds wonderful. If you'd be so kind, let us know how we can contact you.
Well, the most easiest thing is www.faithlessfeminist.com. And you can subscribe to it, or you can just bookmark it. And I let everybody know through that website kind of what's up. And I did thoroughly appreciate it talking to you too. You had great questions and interesting background.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to having you back when you have your new book out.
Bye.
Awesome. Take care. Bye-bye.
And that was my conversation with Karen Garst. That's it for Reason Revolution this week. Please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. If there's a platform you listen to podcasts on that I'm not on, please let me know and I'll try to make it happen. Send us your feedback at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. Also follow our Facebook page at facebook.com/reasonrevolution. As always, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, my personal Facebook, YouTube, and Tumblr at The Daily Clark. Until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.